The clink of my teacup still echoed when my daughter, my only child, laughed and told her friends she pretends not to hear when chores come up. Still, I stood perfectly still, her mother smiling like I'd raised a stranger wearing my last name. As the laughter spread, the word mom rang loudest, light, dismissive, rehearsed, like I was a relic, not a person. While they moved on to mimosas and empowerment talk, I memorized the sting behind every syllable. That's when I realized she hadn't outgrown me, she'd rewritten me. The same mother she dismissed as half-hearing just erased her with full clarity. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The house was bright, too bright, with the kind of cleanliness that felt unnatural, like it had been staged for an audience who didn't truly live here. Marilyn stepped inside, taking in the soft murmur of polite conversation as she adjusted the hearing aids tucked discreetly behind her ears. She wasn't here to make a scene, just to blend in, though she knew it would be hard, standing in the shadow of her daughter's polished world. Hannah was at the center of it all, wearing that practiced smile she reserved for public moments. The women in the room looked perfectly put together, sipping their mimosas and talking about strong women and empowering each other, their words as light as the air. Marilyn stood near the doorway, hands clasped in front of her, waiting for her moment to slip into the background. Hannah spotted her and raised a hand, too loud, too pointed. "Mom, come here for a second," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter like a well-rehearsed line. Marilyn walked over, careful not to stumble on the smooth floor. Her daughter's smile widened, like she was about to introduce a favorite character in a play. "This is my mom. Ignore her. She's still adjusting to the volume buttons." The room tensed, just for a second, before the polite laughter rolled in. Marilyn's face froze into a smile she didn't feel. She held her teacup tighter, the porcelain cold against her fingers, and swallowed down the sourness that rose in her throat. Hannah wasn't done. Sometimes I think she uses them selectively, especially when dishes are involved. The guest chuckled again, a little too quickly, a little too comfortably. Marilyn's heart sank, but she didn't flinch. She smiled and nodded, the kind of smile you wear when you know you've been forgotten. She heard it all, every word, but she didn't let it show. She knew how to pretend. The conversation moved on, but the weight of the joke stuck to her like glue. She could feel the heat of their eyes, the way they skirted her face, pretending to be interested in the passing of time instead of the mockery it held. Later, after the last of the guests had left, Marilyn stood by the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured yard, the grass stretching out in neat rows like a picture frame. Eli, her grandson, appeared beside her. His presence was a quiet comfort, the only real thing in this fake world. He didn't say anything at first, but he didn't need to. He had seen it too, the way his mother had spoken, the way the others had laughed. Finally, Eli asked, his voice low, "You okay, Grandma?" Marilyn met his eyes, and for a moment, it was like the world shifted. She could feel the quiet concern in his gaze, the one thing that still made her feel seen. She smiled at him, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Eli," she lied, the words coming out softer than she intended. He nodded, but she saw the way his shoulders slumped slightly, as if he too knew it wasn't true. Neither of them had the words to make it right, but it didn't matter. Marilyn turned back to the window, the faint hum of the house behind her. The laughter still echoed in her mind. She would remember it all. She wasn't done yet. The late afternoon light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Marilyn sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The thick folder of documents lay open before her, each page an accounting of a life she'd spent decades building. The house, paid for, no mortgage, savings untouched for years except for small, deliberate withdrawals. Investment accounts, stable but unremarkable. And then her late husband's pension, a source of quiet pride that had supported them both after his death. It was all here in front of her, her assets, her legacy, her world. But it wasn't the numbers or the balance sheets that had caught her attention today. It was the beneficiary designations, the ones that still named Hannah and Derek as the primary heirs to everything she had. Everything. The words on the page felt like a betrayal, even though she knew they had been written years ago, before the jokes, before the insults. Back when Hannah had been her strong daughter, the one who valued family, the one who never thought she'd be the punchline of her own life. The thought settled in her chest, like a stone sinking deep into still water. Marilyn ran a finger over the words, as if she could erase them with the slightest touch. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. She blinked and glanced at the clock. Carla, as always, had impeccable timing. When Marilyn opened the door, Carla was standing there with a Tupperware container in one hand, a knowing smile on her face. "Coffee cake," she said, her voice warm but laced with the faintest edge of something sharper. "Figured you might need a little something after today." Marilyn stepped aside, and Carla made herself at home, slipping off her coat and settling into the chair across from her at the table. As she opened the container, the rich scent of cinnamon and sugar filled the air. "Thank you," Marilyn murmured, but her eyes never left the stack of papers. She didn't need to say much more. Carla was used to this. The quiet moments, the ones where words weren't necessary. Carla picked up a fork, took a bite of cake, and studied Marilyn for a long beat. "I would have slapped her with the serving spoon," she said, as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. Marilyn's lips curled into a thin smile, though the humor never quite reached her eyes. "I'll do better," she replied, her voice low but steady. Carla nodded once, a knowing look passing between them. She knew that when Marilyn said, "I'll do better," it was never a promise to simply move on. It was a quiet declaration of intent. The silence that stretched between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was full of unspoken understanding. Carla knew what Marilyn was doing, knew that in her own way, she was already taking control. When Marilyn finally spoke again, her voice was calm, but the words carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "I want to restructure everything." Carla raised an eyebrow, her fork pausing midair. "You're serious." "I'm serious." "Leaving it all to Eli then?" Carla asked, her tone neutral but probing. It wasn't a question born out of judgment, but from a deeper understanding of how Marilyn had been treated. She'd watched the way Hannah had distanced herself over the years, the subtle cruelty that had crept into their relationship, and she'd seen the way Marilyn had taken it all in stride. But now things were different. Marilyn nodded, her eyes flicking back to the papers in front of her. "Not just Eli, but I'm making sure the rest of them don't have a say." Carla set her fork down with a soft clink. She knew exactly what Marilyn meant. Hannah and Derek, together, they thought they could just waltz into this place and take what they wanted, as if their names on a piece of paper meant they had any claim to what Marilyn had worked for. "And Ruth?" Carla asked, her voice a little softer now. She had never liked Ruth Ing's sharp edges, but she knew the attorney had a way of getting things done when Marilyn needed it. Marilyn didn't answer immediately. She just reached for her phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. It rang twice before Ruth's voice answered, crisp and efficient. "Ruth," Marilyn said, her tone even. "I need to make some changes. I want to restructure everything." There was a pause on the other end, a brief silence, and then Ruth's voice, knowing and unyielding. "Are we correcting a mistake or delivering a message?" Marilyn's lips tightened into a slight smile. She thought of the brunch, of Hannah's words, of the subtle dismissal, and of the guests who'd laughed, pretending not to see what was really happening. The answer came easily. "Both," she said, "but mostly, it's a message." Ruth's response was quiet, but Marilyn could hear the sharpness in her voice. "Understood. I'll make sure it's done." As Marilyn hung up, she felt a sense of finality settle over her. The plan was set in motion. There was no going back now. Carla watched her, waiting for her to say more, but Marilyn just turned back to the papers, her fingers tracing over the names on the beneficiary forms. "You know," Carla said after a long moment, her voice tinged with a little humor, "you're gonna leave them speechless." Marilyn's smile was small but satisfied. "Let them speak. I won't be listening." And with that, she began the quiet work of erasing everything they thought they were entitled to. Marilyn sat across from Ruth Ung at a corner table in a quiet downtown cafe. Neutral ground. No ties to family, no lingering ghosts in the wallpaper. The clink of cups and silverware offered a kind of cover, a soundtrack for decisions that would echo well beyond this booth. Ruth slid a sleek leather folder across the table, her expression unreadable. "This is everything we discussed. All assets will be held by the trust. Not one document mentions their names." Marilyn opened it slowly, her fingers steady but cool to the touch. Each page was precise, language sharpened to a fine point. House, investments, pension, all swept under the clean protection of a living trust. All ownership shifted from her person to the entity. Not erased, reassigned. Quietly, permanently. "And Eli?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Primary beneficiary," Ruth confirmed, with legal clauses that bar parental access, override emergency interference, and guarantee independent control by the time he turns 25. Marilyn nodded once, then looked out the window at the passing buses, the students drifting toward campus. Her late husband, William, used to sit by that same window on Saturdays, nursing coffee and reading the paper. The memory flickered through her, sharp and sweet. "I'm donating half his pension to Eastside High," she said suddenly, her voice even. "Scholarship fund. In his name." Ruth didn't blink. "It's in the trust notes. Tax-sheltered. Structured for longevity. No loopholes." It was the kind of thing William would have wanted. He'd believed in second chances. Quiet kids with promise. Students whose names were never called in awards assemblies, but showed up every day, heads down, hearts open. Back at the house, Carla was sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, sorting through yellowed envelopes and bent photo albums spread across the floor like a family archaeology dig. "I should charge you for emotional labor," she said, holding up a photo of a much younger Marilyn, beaming beside a birthday cake, while Hannah, maybe 12, stood off to the side, arms crossed. Marilyn took the photo gently and set it aside. "Not that one." Carla didn't ask why. She just moved on, sliding the next stack into a manila folder labeled "For Eli," archive in Marilyn's crisp handwriting. They worked in silence for a while, fingers brushing old memories, discarding some, preserving others. Carla paused when she reached a black and white picture of William holding infant Eli, his face soft and exhausted with pride. "This one?" she asked, more gently. Marilyn stared at it for a moment, then, front page of the archive. By dusk, the photos were packed, labeled, and ready to be transferred into the trust-protected archive clause. Not just wealth, context. A record of love, of choice, of who mattered and who didn't show up when it counted. The next morning, Ruth filed the trust documents with the Dane County Records Office. No fanfare, no announcement, just a series of digital stamps and encrypted signatures that sealed it all with finality. Marilyn stood by her front window when the confirmation email came through. She didn't read the whole message, just the subject line, "Living Trust, fully executed and locked." She exhaled slowly, as though she'd been holding her breath for years. Across the street, Hannah's SUV pulled into her driveway. Marilyn watched her daughter get out, laughing into her Bluetooth headset, face tilted toward the last of the autumn sun. There was no sign she knew anything had changed, but it had. She was out, and not a soul could undo it. Marilyn closed the laptop, turned, and walked toward the hallway, where one framed photo remained uncovered on the wall. William and Eli, both smiling, both listening. She paused, then pulled a drawer open and removed a flash drive, blank, for now, but not for long. The evening sun slanted low through the windows, casting long, slanting shadows over the table where Marilyn sat. A half-empty glass of wine beside her, the soft hum of the house around her. There was a quiet comfort in it now, as if the weight of the last few weeks had lifted, leaving behind something almost serene. She stared at the open laptop in front of her, the final documents from the trust still there, waiting. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, poised. But she didn't need to look at them. She knew them by heart. Every clause, every name, every quiet decision she had made. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a familiar name. Hannah. Marilyn considered not answering. But she did, lifting the phone to her ear, her voice calm and controlled. "Hello? Mom?" Hannah's voice came through, a little too bright, a little too forced. Are you upset about the brunch?" Marilyn didn't pause. Not at all, she said simply. I heard exactly what I needed to. There was a long, almost imperceptible silence on the other end. Marilyn could hear the shuffle of paper, a faint clink of something in the background, probably Derek moving around, making his presence known in the way he always did. The kind of small noise that spoke volumes. She imagined him in the background, half listening, wondering how far this conversation would go before it became uncomfortable. Hannah cleared her throat, trying to laugh it off. We were just being playful, Mom. You know how it is. It's all in good fun. Marilyn didn't flinch. Didn't offer the expected sigh or fake understanding. She had outgrown that. So was I, she replied. Her voice as even as it had been since the moment the trust had been filed. When I rewrote my will. There was a pause that stretched just long enough to show Hannah wasn't quite sure how to navigate this conversation. Marilyn could practically see her daughter's expression, tight, rehearsed, trying to hold on to the image of being the perfect daughter even though the cracks had started showing. Cracks that couldn't be filled with words alone. I just thought, Hannah began, but Marilyn didn't let her finish. You thought I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't hear what was said. Marilyn's voice dropped slightly, just enough to hold the weight of her words. But I did. Every word. Hannah's breath caught. And for the first time in a long time, Marilyn heard something unfamiliar in her daughter's tone. A flicker of uncertainty, but it didn't matter. She wasn't interested in Hannah's discomfort. Not anymore. Mom, please, Hannah said, almost pleading now. I didn't mean it. Marilyn interrupted, her voice clear and final. It doesn't matter what you meant. It's what you said. And now everything has changed. She could hear Hannah swallow, the silence growing thick on the line. What did you do? Hannah finally asked, her voice small, no longer the commanding one from earlier. What changes did you make? Marilyn smiled to herself, a slight curl of her lips that wasn't shared, but felt like it should have been. Wait and see, she said, and hung up before Hannah could say another word. The phone went silent in her hand, and for a moment, Marilyn simply sat there, feeling the weight of her own decisions settle in like a final note of a song, ringing out long after the sound had faded. She wasn't sure if she was supposed to feel guilty. She didn't. There was nothing to feel guilty for. Hannah's concern, her sudden change of heart, it wasn't real. It was the sound of someone who knew they had pushed too far and realized too late that the edge they had walked on had already given way beneath them. Marilyn set the phone down and stood. Walking over to the window, she watched as the shadows outside stretched further, the last light of the day dimming into something soft and inevitable. In the other room, her desk was still piled with papers, notes, photographs, the archive for Eli that was slowly becoming a legacy of its own. But now, it wasn't just about protecting what she had left. It was about creating something new, something that would carry forward the pieces of her life that mattered, things Hannah would never truly understand. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. Marilyn had filled it with the decisions she had made, decisions that no one could take away from her, not anymore. Just then, Ruth's email arrived. Another notification that the letter of disinheritance had been filed. No claim, no future. It was done. The trust was sealed. Marilyn looked at the message, reading the brief confirmation. It felt final. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard again, poised but no longer uncertain. No legal claim remains. Her lips parted in the softest of smiles, and she closed the laptop. It was over. The house was silent, save for the soft clicking of Marilyn's fingers on the keyboard. The laptop screen glowed faintly in the dim room, casting an almost ghostly light on her face. She sat in the darkened living room, the weight of her decisions hanging heavy around her. The evening air had grown cool, and she was alone in the stillness, save for the voice now playing softly through her speakers. It was the recording, the one from the brunch. She'd downloaded it that afternoon after Hannah's call, and now, as she sat there, the words were ringing in her ears once more, each laugh, each dismissive comment. The sound of the guests, polite but hollow as they fed off the moment. Marilyn let it play in full, her gaze unfocused, her mind moving through the scenes in the recording, tracing every word, every inflection. She wasn't angry anymore. Anger had long since passed. This was different. This was observation, This was the sound of betrayal in plain sight. The recording clicked off, and Marilyn sat still for a long moment. Her fingers lingered over the mouse, her mind replaying each second of it, almost savoring the quiet sting that came with hearing it again. But she wasn't ashamed. Not anymore. She was the one who had been overlooked, the one who had been silenced for years, and now she had a voice of her own, clear, final, unbreakable. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Carla. She'd been stopping by more often these days, ever since the first steps of the trust had been set in motion. But tonight, there was something heavier in her eyes, a knowing that lingered just beneath the surface. Marilyn let her in, and the two of them settled together on the couch, Carla picking up her wine glass with a small sigh. Marilyn didn't offer her the recording just yet. She let the silence stretch between them. Carla finally spoke, the words rolling out slowly like she was weighing them first. "You're not really going to keep that, are you?" she asked, her tone half teasing, half serious. Marilyn glanced at the flash drive sitting on the table in front of her. "Why not?" Carla took a long sip of her wine. "Because it's dangerous. That recording, Marilyn. It's more than just words. It's proof. Proof they'll never be able to undo. And it'll destroy them. You don't need that kind of power." Marilyn didn't respond immediately. She hadn't asked for power, and she certainly hadn't wanted to wield it so harshly. But when the people closest to you treat you like an afterthought, like a joke to be laughed at, then you learned that you needed to protect what mattered. "I don't need to destroy them," Marilyn said quietly. "I just need to make sure they never forget." Carla was quiet for a moment, her eyes studying Marilyn. She understood more than most. She knew what it felt like to be seen as expendable, to be quietly pushed to the side by those who should have cherished you the most. "You could submit it," Carla suggested, her voice soft but laced with an edge. "Send it to the ethics committee. Let the world know what they did." The thought lingered in the air, heavy and sharp. Marilyn felt the pull of it, of exposing Hannah, of making sure everyone knew the truth. But she also knew it was a choice that would change everything, in ways she wasn't sure she was ready for. Just then, Marilyn's phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with Ruth's name. She had been waiting for this call, another step in finalizing everything. She answered, the conversation brief but direct. "We filed the letter," Ruth said on the other end, her voice clipped but steady. "It's done. No more claims, no more interference." Marilyn nodded as if Ruth could see her, the weight of the words sinking in. There was finality in that, something clean, something decisive. But there was also something else, a quiet knowing that all of this could be laid bare for the world to see if she wanted it to. After the call, Marilyn turned back to Carla. "Ruth says we win more with silence than scandal." Carla chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Ruth's always had a way with words. "You think she's right?" Marilyn took the flash drive from the table and held it between her fingers, her eyes tracing the label. Final word. She wasn't going to submit it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it would remain there, locked away. A reminder. "I don't need to make a scene," Marilyn said softly. "I just need them to understand." Carla didn't argue. She understood. Marilyn stood up, walking to her desk, where a small drawer remained slightly ajar. She placed the flash drive inside and locked it away. As she turned back toward the window, her gaze falling on the quiet, empty street outside, she felt a strange peace settle over her. The world had shifted, irrevocably. And she was the one in control now. The recording, like so many things, would stay in the past, safely locked away for when it was needed. For now, silence was her strongest weapon. But that silence, it was the loudest message of all. The banquet hall buzzed with polite chatter, soft laughter filling the air. Marilyn stood near the back of the room, quietly composed, watching as her daughter took the stage. Hannah wore a smile that could light up the room, her voice carrying effortlessly through the crowd. The evening was about honoring women, women who had shaped the future with their strength, resilience, and wisdom. But Marilyn, as always, stayed in the background, quiet, composed, a ghost at her own daughter's event. Hannah spoke into the microphone, a practiced warmth in her tone. "Today we celebrate the strong women who raised us," she said. "The ones who showed us what it means to be resilient, to be brave, the women who taught us how to lead with compassion, strength, and grace. The crowd applauded, nodding in agreement. Marilyn stood still, her hands clasped in front of her, watching her daughter with a quiet intensity. Hannah's words floated in the air, but they never reached her. The irony was sharp. Marilyn was here, in this room, in front of all these people. But Hannah didn't mention her, not once. Not even a passing nod. The woman who had given up so much, who had made so many sacrifices, was nothing more than a background noise in her own daughter's celebration. Marilyn didn't move during the applause. She stood there, still, as the words echoed in her mind. She doesn't even know. She couldn't help but feel that quiet sting of realization, the same one that had haunted her for years. When the speech ended, Marilyn quietly excused herself, slipping out through the side door, unnoticed. She didn't want to make a scene. The words had already been said, and there was nothing more to prove. But as she passed Hannah's desk, she paused for a moment. She placed a card on top of the neat stack of papers in front of her. Strength listens before it speaks. The words were simple, but they felt final. She didn't need to stay and wait for Hannah's recognition. She didn't need anything from her daughter anymore. Outside, the cool air was a sharp contrast to the stuffy warmth of the hall. Marilyn stood there, taking in a slow breath. There was peace in this moment, a quiet sense of finality that she hadn't expected. She didn't need Hannah's appreciation. She didn't need the speeches. She didn't even need an apology. What mattered was what she had done for herself. Later that evening, Ruth's email arrived. Marilyn opened it, reading the words that confirmed her decisions had been made. Medical, financial, and legal authority now formally locked away from Hannah. A small smile curled at the corner of Marilyn's lips. It was done. She had the power now, and no one would take it from her. Marilyn closed the laptop, walking back to her desk. The flash drive labeled Final Word remained safely locked away, its contents known only to her. She didn't need to say another word. The silence now spoke louder than anything else. Marilyn sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The voicemail from Hannah had been saved, its contents sharp and raw, a stark contrast to the veneer of civility Hannah had always worn. Marilyn had known it would come, her daughter, suddenly desperate, asking for help with the things she had long ignored. She clicked forward, sending the voicemail to Ruth, without a second thought. Ruth's response came almost immediately, as expected. Help? We're 10 documents deep. They're legally erased. Marilyn allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Ruth was right. Everything was in place. Every document, every clause, every precaution. No more interference, no more manipulation. The finality of it was still sinking in, but it felt right. For the first time in a long time, Marilyn had control over the narrative. Her mind drifted to the family portraits that lined the walls of her home, photos that had once been symbols of her sacrifices, her love, her place within the family. But now they felt more like relics of a past that no longer served her. With quiet resolve, she began removing the frames one by one. Each photograph was a memory she had long carried but was now ready to release. She replaced them with something different. Art Eli had made for her. A series of paintings, abstract and vivid, full of color and energy. Art from the only person who had truly seen her, who had never treated her as an afterthought. Standing back, she studied the new arrangement. It felt good, more real than the frozen images of a family that had never fully appreciated her. Marilyn's gaze shifted to her desk, where the trust documents lay. Her final edition had been simple but crucial. Public release after my death, naming the disinherited and why. It was not to harm, but to ensure the truth was known. Let them know why they were erased, and why the legacy they thought they'd inherit was gone. Carla had helped her plan a living memorial event. I want to hear the kind things while I'm still alive, Carla had joked. But there was truth in it. Marilyn wasn't waiting for praise after she was gone. She wanted to hear the words now, while she could still feel them. Later that evening, Marilyn made a donation to the State Hearing Loss Center in Eli's name. She had always wanted to give back, and now, in this quiet way, it felt like the right thing to do. Eli would be proud, and for once, Marilyn felt a peace she hadn't known before. As she sat back, The weight of everything she had done settled over her. She didn't need help. She didn't need their approval. The silence she had created spoke louder than any gesture ever could. And it was final. The post appeared on Marilyn's feed the next morning, just as the sun was breaking through the blinds, casting soft light over the kitchen. Hannah's smiling face, pristine as always, filled the screen, her arm draped over her own family. A portrait of domestic perfection, the caption reading, "So grateful for the strong women who raised us. You're lucky to have her." The comments flooded in almost immediately, as they always did. "So sweet. You're lucky to have her, and even such an inspiration." The likes ticked upward, one after another, hundreds of them, like a chorus of voices chanting in unison. The image, the words, the curated gratitude. It was all so perfect, so polished, so fake. Marilyn's thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment as she stared at the photo. There was no mention of her. Not once. No acknowledgement of the woman who had shaped everything. Her, the grandmother, the one who had silently carried the weight of her family's expectations. The woman who had sat quietly in the background for so long, pretending to be invisible. Pretending to be okay with the role she had been handed. Carla's message popped up a few seconds later. "You should comment. She doesn't even know the volume's up." Marilyn read the words and let herself smile briefly. Half amused, half sad. Carla always knew how to find the sharp edge of a situation, but Marilyn didn't respond. She didn't need to. Not anymore. She simply saved the post, tucked it away in her archive. It wasn't worth commenting on. It wasn't worth giving any more of her energy to. The trust had already been filed, Ruth's email arriving shortly after, confirming that the final version was now with the Department of Records. Irreversible, locked in place. Marilyn could feel the weight of it settling in, a quiet peace mixed with a sense of liberation. All the careful planning, the restructuring, the distance between her and them. It was now legally bulletproof. There would be no more interference, no more pretending. It was all done. Eli came over later that afternoon, a soft knock on the door, followed by the sound of his shoes on the wooden floor. He was holding something in his hands, a small folded piece of paper. He handed it to Marilyn with a shy smile. "I wrote this for you," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "For your birthday." Marilyn unfolded the paper carefully, and there it was. A poem, written in the kind of raw, unpolished language that only a teenager could offer. But it was beautiful. It spoke of listening, of being heard, of the quiet strength in silence. She read it twice, then looked up at him. He was watching her, his eyes waiting for her reaction. She smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a long while. "This is beautiful, Eli," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." He shrugged, a little embarrassed, but his smile was wide. "I'm glad you like it." Marilyn walked over to her small shelf, where her hearing aids sat quietly, almost forgotten. She placed the poem beside them, framed it in a simple wooden frame. It felt right, in a way that nothing had felt right in years. The hearing aids had always been a symbol of something she didn't want to face, a reminder of the way she had been dismissed, the way she had been made to feel invisible. But now, with the poem beside them, they felt like something else, something more. It was a quiet testament to her resilience, a reminder that even when others didn't see her, she had always been listening, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Marilyn sat back in her chair, looking at the shelf, at the poem and the hearing aids, the small everyday symbols of her life. She didn't need Hannah's acknowledgement. She didn't need the gratitude they performed for others to see. Eli had seen her, and that was enough. In the silence of the room, she felt a deep peace. The world might not understand her, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that she had finally understood herself. The phone rang late that afternoon, its persistent tone breaking the silence that had settled over Marilyn's house. She knew who it was before the name flashed on the screen. Hannah. She took a steady breath and with a quiet, deliberate motion, picked it up. "Hello?" Marilyn's voice was calm, composed, the usual steadiness settling in. "Mom," Hannah's voice was tight, like she had something to say but wasn't sure how to say it. I wanted to check in. I'm wondering about the care arrangements. You know, for when. She trailed off, not quite finishing the sentence. Marilyn could hear the hesitation, the fear, the subtle undercurrent of control slipping through. It wasn't the concern of a loving daughter, it was the worry of someone unsure of her place. All care arrangements are already finalized, Marilyn replied, without missing a beat. Her voice was clear, unwavering. No need to worry. There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment, Marilyn wondered if Hannah would press further. But instead, Hannah's voice came back, softer now, more insistent. I don't understand. I mean, could you clarify? I know we've talked about this before, but I'm not sure what you mean by finalized. Marilyn smiled faintly to herself, the same calm smile she had worn for so many years. You'll receive it, she said, her words weighted with finality. One day. Hannah let out a short sigh, her frustration barely hidden behind the thin veil of politeness. Okay, she said, though there was no real acceptance in the tone, if that's how you want it. Goodbye, Hannah, Marilyn said, her voice cutting through the words that hung in the air. She didn't wait for her daughter to respond before hanging up. The conversation was over. It had been decided long ago. When Marilyn had first begun taking the steps to ensure her wishes would be honored, long before the world of questions and uncertainty had ever entered the picture. The air in the room felt different now, like the weight of Hannah's lingering doubts had been lifted. Marilyn walked to the kitchen, moving deliberately, as though each step mattered. She took the wine from the cabinet and poured herself a glass, its red hue dark against the dimming light of the evening. As she sipped, she thought about the trust again, about the steps she'd taken, the irrevocable nature of it all. It was done. A soft knock sounded at the door, pulling Marilyn from her thoughts. She opened it to find Carla standing on the threshold, her hand holding a bottle of champagne and a knowing smile on her face. Early celebration, Carla asked, her tone light but filled with understanding. Marilyn took the bottle from Carla's hand and walked back toward the kitchen. No, she replied, her voice steady, just appreciating the calm. Carla followed her into the kitchen, setting the glasses down with a clink. You know, it's not just the legal stuff that matters, Carla said, her voice soft. It's the quiet peace that follows. The weight of having made your choices. They can't undo it. Marilyn nodded, allowing herself a brief moment of quiet acknowledgement. It was true. Everything had been set in motion, and now there was only silence. The kind of silence that carried more weight than any argument ever could. The doorbell rang again, this time with the familiar sound of Ruth's voice through the speaker. Marilyn opened the door, letting Ruth in without a word. Ruth moved with purpose, a briefcase in hand, her expression unreadable as she handed over the final set of documents. It's done, Ruth said, her voice low and matter-of-fact. The clause barring Hannah from making medical decisions in any emergency scenario is now part of the official trust. There's no way for her to legally interfere. Marilyn's lips curled into a slight smile, a small, satisfied gesture. She hadn't needed to explain herself to anyone. Not to Hannah, not to anyone else. The choice had been hers alone, and she had done it with quiet precision. Thank you, Ruth, Marilyn said simply. She didn't need to say more. Ruth understood. The work had been thorough. There was no more room for questions. As Ruth left, Carla poured the champagne, her eyes reflecting the soft light of the room. Marilyn raised her glass, her gaze steady and focused. To the peace we've earned, Carla said, her voice warm. Marilyn nodded, her eyes on the glass, on the quiet that now filled her life. To the peace we've earned, she echoed. As they clinked glasses, the quiet truth settled deeper into Marilyn's heart. The future was hers, and no one would ever take that from her. Eli stood at the edge of the small gathering, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, eyes on the floor. It was his moment. A moment that had come too quietly for anyone but Marilyn to truly appreciate. The scholarship he had been awarded was something more than just money. It was a chance, a future, a recognition that he didn't have to keep fading into the background. For the first time, his name was on the list, his achievements acknowledged, not as the son of someone important, but as someone important in his own right. Marilyn watched from the other side of the room, her heart swelling with pride. The others had no idea what it had cost her to make this happen. Not just the financial commitment, but the emotional weight of it. The promise she had made to herself. Eli was a bright young man, and he deserved every opportunity. She walked over to him, her steps steady, as if she were walking through a moment that felt entirely hers to own. She stood beside him for a moment before speaking softly. "I helped fund it." Eli turned to her, his expression a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "Why me?" His voice cracked slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Marilyn smiled at him, that soft smile that always seemed to appear when she was completely sure of herself. "Because you saw me. You didn't flinch at the silence," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You never treated me as invisible, Eli. You listened when no one else did." Eli's eyes shimmered, and for a moment he looked as though he might tear up. But he quickly blinked it away, fighting to hold himself together. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick. "I don't know what to say." Marilyn placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You don't need to say anything. Just do something with it." Later, at the dinner Hannah hosted in Eli's honor, the air was filled with the clinking of silverware and soft conversations about future prospects. Marilyn had been invited, of course, but she hadn't felt the need to attend. Not after the way things had unfolded. She had received the invitation with a small laugh, a final, hollow gesture on Hannah's part to make it look as though they were all still one happy family. Marilyn could see through it. Hannah would take full credit, make the moment about her own success, not Eli's, just like she had done with every other moment in their lives. Instead, Marilyn stayed home. She didn't need to participate in the charade. She had already done more than enough. Instead of attending the dinner, she wrapped a small gift and sent it to Eli. A book, Listening with Intent. The Power of Observation. She included a note that read, "This is the most important thing I can teach you. Hear the world for what it is, not just what you want it to be." When Hannah received the gift, she smiled politely, though Marilyn could see the thin layer of disapproval beneath the surface. It wasn't a lavish enough gesture, perhaps, too quiet, too subtle, but Hannah's comment wasn't one of praise. It was more about her own sense of control. "I'm sure Eli will appreciate this," she'd said, brushing off the moment like so many others before it. Later, when she and Derek discussed the event, Hannah made sure to tell him how important it was that they maintain a sense of unity, of pride. She threw a small self-congratulatory smile in Eli's direction when he finally came into the room. "It's all about family, right?" she said, though the words rang hollow. Carla, when Marilyn recounted the evening to her later, had a small, knowing smile on her lips. "They're living in the echo of what they missed," she said softly, her voice edged with the kind of wisdom that only time could bring. Marilyn didn't need to say anything. She understood exactly what Carla meant. They were still pretending, still acting as if their version of events was the truth. But it wasn't. Marilyn had known for years now that her family's narrative would never be theirs to control. They had missed it. They had missed everything, her quiet strength, her sacrifices, her unseen love. Eli, though, he understood. And that was enough. She didn't need anything else from anyone. As she sat in her chair, the evening falling softly around her, Marilyn felt a deep, settled peace. She had shaped the future in her own way, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Eli would never forget that, and that was the legacy that truly mattered. The world might never understand her choices, but she didn't need them to. She had done it all on her terms, and that was more than enough. The thick envelope sat on Marilyn's kitchen table, the official seal catching the light in a way that felt too loud, too final. She had known it was coming, the petition from Hannah, asking for a reconsideration, pleading for a return to the terms she had been cut from. Marilyn took her time as she opened it, careful to tear along the edges, and then removed the contents with deliberate slowness. The papers inside were crisp, marked with bold print, and laced with the same urgency that had always followed Hannah. She placed them in front of her, one page after another, Hannah's request, her rationale, the legal statements arguing that Marilyn's decisions had been made in error, that they had been unfairly excluded. Each document was met with a slight shake of her head. She had read these words before, in different forms. always with the same underlying need for control. But this time, it was different. The letter from Ruth arrived a few moments later, crisp and efficient, just like everything Ruth did. Full documentation attached, evaluations, statements, legal records included. The response had been prepared well in advance, with no room for doubt. Marilyn read through it once, then again. Ruth had left nothing to chance. Marilyn moved toward the phone, her fingers already dialing Ruth's number. She didn't need to say much. Ruth had everything in order. "It's done, Marilyn," Ruth said after a moment, her voice neutral but sharp. "Hearing's been set. It's been denied. The judge said it borders on harassment. You won't hear from them again." Marilyn leaned back in her chair, a quiet sigh escaping her lips. The words felt good. She could already imagine Hannah's frustration, how this would fuel her belief that everything had been taken unfairly. But it didn't matter. It had been settled in the only way that mattered, legally, irrevocably. The victory, however, didn't feel like much of a triumph. Marilyn stood up and moved to the window, her gaze wandering out over the stillness of the street. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches reaching toward the sky in silent defiance. She had been patient. She had waited. Now she had the peace of knowing the weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Later, as the evening fell and the house grew quiet again, Marilyn sat down at her desk, pulling the final version of her obituary from the drawer. She had made sure there was no mention of Hannah. It wasn't spite, it was simply a fact. The truth she had learned was often quieter than the noise people tried to make of it. She made a few more changes. The memorial fund that had once been named after her husband and herself was now renamed the Clarity Endowment. It felt fitting after everything that had unfolded. It was her final gesture, her lasting legacy, something that would speak for her even when her voice was no longer needed. The paperwork for the endowment was simple. It was final. The terms were clear, and Eli's name was at the forefront. He would be the one to carry it forward, just as he had been the one to carry the weight of Marilyn's choices. The future was his to shape now, not Hannah's, not Derek's, just his. As the last signatures were made, Marilyn leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a moment of silence. She'd done it. It was done. Later, Ruth called with another piece of news. Eli was to be the trustee in training. Ruth would mentor him, guide him through every step, ensuring the future of the trust was secure and protected. Marilyn smiled faintly at the thought of Eli's quiet determination. He was young, but he understood more than anyone ever had. "He's ready, Ruth," Marilyn said, her voice steady. "I know. I'll make sure he's prepared." Marilyn paused, the weight of the decision settling deeper within her. "I wanted her to listen," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Now she never gets to speak for me again." Ruth didn't respond immediately. There was nothing more to say. The finality of it all settled over Marilyn like a warm cloak, comforting and heavy. The trust was locked in place, and Eli was ready to carry it. The future was no longer hers to shape. It was his. And in that moment, Marilyn knew she had done everything she could for him. As she sat in the quiet of her home, the weight of years of silence, of decisions made, of voices never heard, began to fade. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. The clarity was there, in her choices, in the quiet spaces she had left behind for those who could understand. And for the first time in a long time, Marilyn felt at peace. Marilyn opened the letter with a practiced hand, the familiar handwriting on the envelope unmistakable. It was from Hannah. She could feel the weight of it, the final attempt to regain some semblance of control over a situation that had already been decided. She unfolded the pages slowly, reading the words with careful detachment. The letter was full of the same empty apologies she'd received so many times before. "I'm sorry, Mom. I never meant to hurt you. I realize now how distant I've been. I want to make it right." The words blurred as Marilyn read them, her eyes moving over the vague phrases, misunderstandings, things I didn't realize, hope we can find a way forward. It was a carefully crafted deflection, not an apology. There was no real accountability, no true understanding of the hurt caused. Just the same words, rearranged, as though time could be rewritten. She set the letter down without much thought. Staring at it for a moment longer, she knew what it meant. Nothing. It was too late. The trust had been set, the decisions made. No letter, no apology could undo the years of silence, the years of being unseen. Marilyn placed the letter carefully in the trust file, under the tab. Documentation of pattern. She didn't need to keep it, but she couldn't ignore it either. It was part of the narrative she'd lived with for far too long, the attempt to rewrite history without understanding it. Carla's voice echoed in her mind. Even her apologies are airbrushed. And it was true. They never went deep enough. Always surface level, always designed to absolve without confronting the truth. The doorbell rang, breaking her thoughts. Marilyn opened the door to find Ruth standing there, briefcase in hand, a quiet presence that had become familiar. "We're almost done," Ruth said, her gaze shifting to the papers on Marilyn's desk. "Any final changes before we seal this completely?" Marilyn paused, looking over at the file, the letter now buried inside it. The finality of it all settled over her like a soft weight. There was nothing left to change. Everything had been decided, and no amount of pleading or revisiting would alter that. She glanced at Ruth and spoke quietly. "Just one." Ruth didn't need to ask what it was. She knew Marilyn had made up her mind long ago. Marilyn's voice was steady, final. "I want the hearing center to include a plaque, dedicated to the unheard. May they find volume in themselves." Ruth gave a slow nod of approval, the weight of Marilyn's words not lost on her. "It will be done." Marilyn stood there for a moment, her gaze drifting to the small shelf by the window. The silence had become something she no longer feared. It had become her strength, her final testament. She didn't need to speak to be heard anymore. As Ruth left, Marilyn sat back down at her desk, her thoughts settling into a quiet peace. She had made her choices, and no one could take that away from her. The letter, the petition, the endless attempts to control the narrative. They were now just fragments of the past. The future was clear, and it would be Eli's to carry forward. Marilyn leaned back in her chair, the last of the light fading from the window, and for the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. Eli arrived at Marilyn's house that afternoon with the photo carefully wrapped in his hands. When he opened the door, he didn't speak immediately, just stood there holding it, as though giving her time to recognize what it meant. Marilyn glanced up from the stack of papers she'd been sorting through. She hadn't expected him today, but the sight of him brought a sense of calm she hadn't realized she was missing. His presence had always been a quiet comfort, steady and grounded. And this moment, whatever the photo was his to share. He held it out to her with both hands. "I didn't want them to toss this," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. The photograph was old, the edges worn from years of being shuffled between boxes and drawers. In it, Marilyn and Eli were sitting together on the porch, laughing. It had been taken long before everything had fallen apart. She recognized the memory. It was from the summer Eli had first stayed with her. A time before the world had gotten heavy with unspoken things. Marilyn took the photograph from his hands, her fingers brushing against his for a moment. She looked at the image in silence, seeing both the innocence of that time and the years that had passed since. "You should keep it," she said softly, offering the photo back to him. But Eli shook his head, his gaze firm. "No," he said quietly. "This is yours." He paused before adding, "I wanted you to have it." Marilyn smiled then, the kind of smile that came when words weren't enough. "Let's keep the half that mattered," she said, her voice steady. Together, they carefully trimmed the photograph, cutting away the parts that no longer fit, the moments that weren't theirs to remember. The half of the photo that remained was simply her and Eli, laughing under the sun. It was a simpler time, a time before the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. They mounted the photo in a simple frame, and Marilyn set it on her desk, next to the collection of memories she had carefully curated over the years. It felt right there. Only the two of them. Carla, who had been watching from the doorway, came over and stood beside them. Her arms crossed and her eyes soft with understanding. She looked at the framed photo with a thoughtful expression. "Looks like the whole picture to me," she said, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. Marilyn and Eli exchanged a look, their quiet bond clear. "It is," Marilyn replied, her voice firm with finality. Later, as evening fell and the house grew quiet again, Marilyn sat with Eli at the kitchen table. He had started helping her with the final documents, gathering things for the trust, making sure everything was in order. He'd learned a lot over the past few months, and though it had been a steep curve for him, there was no doubt in Marilyn's mind that he was ready. Ruth had been working closely with him, guiding him through the details, teaching him what it meant to manage the trust with integrity. Marilyn had always known Eli would be the one to carry it forward. He had the strength, the heart, and now, with Ruth's help, he would have the knowledge too. Marilyn watched him work, his concentration unwavering, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to lift. She had made her choices. She had done everything for him, not for the praise, not for recognition, but because he had always seen her for who she truly was. There was a soft knock at the door. Marilyn stood to answer it, expecting Ruth. But this time, it wasn't Ruth. It was a letter. The return address was from the local community center, and inside, Marilyn found an invitation to a new initiative, community-based listening therapy. A new program designed to provide resources and support to those with hearing loss, focusing on education, communication, and empowerment. Marilyn felt a quiet satisfaction in the moment. The trust now included a fund for this initiative, a way for her legacy to live on in a community that had supported her and Eli through the years. She sat down at the table, the invitation resting in her hands. Eli, who had been looking over the final paperwork, noticed her pause and glanced over. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle, curious. Marilyn smiled, handing the letter to him. "It's a new chapter," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "And it's yours to carry, too." Eli read through the letter with interest, nodding slowly. He looked up at Marilyn, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "We're doing something good here, aren't we?" "We are," Marilyn said, her voice steady. "And we'll keep doing it, one step at a time." In that moment, Marilyn knew her work was done. The silence she had fought for had created a space for the future, one that would be filled with Eli's strength, with the truth she had fought to protect, and with the clarity that would guide them both forward. And that, in the end, was all that truly mattered. The email from Ruth arrived late in the afternoon, concise and to the point, just like everything Ruth did. Marilyn read it once, then again. You were removed with intent, not emotion. It was simple, clear, and final. Hannah is blocked from future filings without court approval. The decision had been made, and it was locked in place. Marilyn leaned back in her chair, the weight of the words settling into her. It had been a long road to get here, but now the future was clear. There was no more need for apologies or explanations. The silence that followed felt like peace. She didn't feel the rush of triumph that she might have expected. She had already known this was coming. She had already done the hard work. Now it was just about watching it unfold. Marilyn picked up her phone and sent a quick message to Ruth to confirm receipt, then set the phone down. The work was done. There was no more to do but live with it. Eli appeared in the doorway, watching her, sensing the shift in the air. Marilyn met his eyes, a soft smile on her face. "Let's go for a walk," she said. The words quiet but sure. Without a word, Eli joined her, and they stepped outside. The air was crisp, the evening sky turning a pale pink as the sun dipped lower. Marilyn didn't reach for her hearing aids. For the first time in a long time, she didn't need them. She listened to the world around her, birds calling in the distance, the rustle of leaves, the low hum of a car driving by, but none of it felt urgent. Eli walked beside her in silence, his presence steady and familiar. It was as though the weight that had settled between them over the years had lifted in that moment. Neither of them spoke, but there was an understanding, a quiet peace that felt more profound than any words could convey. As they walked, Marilyn felt something she hadn't in years, a lightness. She wasn't worried about what had been lost anymore. She wasn't concerned with the silence that used to feel like a burden. For the first time, the quiet felt like freedom. Later, when they returned home, Marilyn found a small card slipped under the door, Carla's handwriting scrawled across the front. She opened it slowly, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile as she read the words inside. "Best silence I've ever heard." It was exactly what she needed to hear. A reminder that the silence she had fought for wasn't something to be feared. It had become her strength, her clarity. That night, as the house grew quiet once more, Marilyn sat at her desk and began to write. The memoir that had been taking shape in her mind for years now had a place on the page. She titled it, Perfect Clarity, a testament to the truth she had fought so long to find, and the silence that had made it all possible. Eli came over and stood behind her, looking at the pages she had already written. "You're really doing this," he said softly, more statement than question. Marilyn glanced up at him and nodded. "I've waited long enough." Eli smiled, a mix of pride and understanding in his eyes. "I can help format it. People need to read this." Marilyn felt a quiet warmth in her chest as she looked at him. It wasn't just her story anymore. It was theirs, one she could share with those who would listen. The future was no longer something to fear. It was something to share, with clarity, and with the right person by her side. "Let's make sure they do," she said quietly, and with that, Marilyn knew the work had been done. The silence that had once felt heavy was now her strongest tool. The future was hers to shape, and she had finally found the courage to speak. Marilyn sat at her desk, the final draft of her memoir lying before her. She had written it in fits and starts, weaving together the threads of a life she had long kept hidden, of silences no one had ever cared to hear. But now it was finished. Perfect Clarity, the title felt right, like a quiet declaration of everything she had fought to preserve. She picked up the pen, adding the last few words, "The end." A weight lifted from her shoulders, but there was no triumph, no celebration. It was simply done. She had spoken her truth. With a soft exhale, she turned to Eli, who had been watching her from across the room, waiting for this moment. His presence was a constant comfort, grounding her as always. "I'm ready," she said quietly. Eli nodded, understanding the significance. Marilyn handed him the first printed copy of the memoir, and he took it with a look of pride mixed with quiet reverence. "I think the library should have this," Marilyn added. "It belongs there, where anyone who needs to hear it can." Eli didn't hesitate. "I'll take care of it," he said, already moving to place the copy in a sturdy envelope. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about ensuring her words would be available for those who had lived through similar silences and could find their own strength in her story. Later that week, the trust was finalized. Every clause, every stipulation was sealed and protected. Marilyn felt a quiet satisfaction as Ruth confirmed that everything was in place, locked away behind the legal boundaries she had carefully crafted. No one, least of all Hannah, could challenge it now. The finality was what she had worked toward, a peace forged in careful, quiet decisions. And then came the most important part, Eli. Marilyn turned to the last page of the trust, where her wishes for Eli were written clearly. He would inherit financial control, full discretion over the funds, and one very important line, "Because you never talked over me." She smiled at the words, knowing the weight they carried. Hannah had never understood the significance of those words. She had never understood the power in listening, in allowing someone their voice. Eli had always understood. He had never dismissed her. And now he would carry it all forward, shaping his future without the noise that had drowned out her own for so many years. In the months that followed, Marilyn lived in a quiet peace. The house felt full, but not of chaos. It was full of purpose, of the clarity she had always known was possible but never had the chance to live until now. She had worked to build this life, a life she could now own completely. Her hearing aid sat beside her bed, resting on a silk cloth, no longer hidden away in the drawer as they once had been. They were honored, not because of the device they represented, but because they had been a symbol of her resilience, her ability to listen even when no one else cared to hear. She had never needed to explain herself to anyone. The silence she had fought for had become her strongest ally. Hannah faded into silence, as Marilyn had known she would. There were no calls, no messages, no apologies followed the letter that had arrived too late. There was no need for them. Marilyn had erased her from the equation, not out of malice, but because the time had passed. Eli visited weekly, as he had promised. They sat together, talking about the future, about the community-based listening therapy initiative that was now thriving, and about the book that had found its place in the library. Marilyn watched him grow, not just into the young man she had always hoped he would be, but into someone who would carry her legacy forward with integrity and strength. One evening, as they sat on the porch, a quiet laughter between them filling the space, Marilyn felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She could hear the sounds of the world around her, birds in the trees, the hum of distant voices, but it no longer mattered. She wasn't defined by the noise. She was defined by the clarity she had found in herself, in the choices she had made, in the quiet strength that had always been hers. And for the first time, she understood something profound. Silence, when earned, was not an absence. It was a presence. It was a form of understanding that could never be taken away. Marilyn glanced at Eli, a soft smile curling at the edges of her lips. "You've got this, Eli," she said, "and I've done my part." The wind stirred the trees, and for the first time in years, Marilyn knew that everything was exactly as it should be. As the evening darkened, she whispered to herself, the final line of her memoir settling into her bones. "My daughter made fun of my hearing aids in front of her friends, so I listened carefully, remembered everything, and erased her with perfect clarity." And with that, Marilyn knew her work was done. The rest would be carried by the silence she had chosen.